France, the year is 1380. The bells of Notre Dame toll for a new king. The boy who would inherit the crown is only 11 years old. His name, Charles, the sixth of that name, son of the Valois line. When Charles VI first ascended the throne, France was a broken kingdom. The 100 Years' War raged with England. Peasants groaned under heavy taxes. Nobles fought each other like wolves for scraps of power. And yet, the young king was full of hope. Charles was handsome, intelligent, and deeply loved by the people. They called him Charles the Well-Beloved. At first, his reign seemed to promise stability after years of turmoil. The boy king grew into a young ruler guided by his uncles, powerful men who used his youth for their own gain. They drained the royal treasury, fought private wars, and schemed endlessly. But as Charles matured, he began to push back. At 17, he declared his independence, dismissing his greedy uncles and surrounding himself with wise and loyal advisors. For a brief, shining moment, France felt the warmth of renewal. The king lowered taxes, brought order to the realm, and worked tirelessly for his people. He rode at the head of armies, shining in armor, leading campaigns against England with courage and fire. The French court celebrated him as the rebirth of royal power. Poets sang of him, nobles bowed before him, and the common folk cheered him in the streets. France had suffered too long, and at last, a true king had risen. But fate had other plans. For beneath the golden crown, the seeds of madness were already stirring. The young king's mind, brilliant, passionate, fiery, carried within it shadows that no sword could defeat. The moment would come when Charles would no longer be the well-beloved, but instead, the mad. And when that madness erupted, it would tear. For nearly a decade, Charles VI ruled with strength and promise. The boy who had once been guided by greedy uncles now stood tall as France's true king. He was beloved, respected, admired. The people whispered that France had finally found its savior. But then, the shadows came. In the summer of 1392, Charles rode at the head of his army through the forests of Le Mans. His mission, to punish a traitor who had attempted to assassinate one of his closest friends. The day was hot, the air tense. Suddenly, without warning, a man leapt from the trees, grasping the king's horse. The stranger cried out, "Do not ride further, noble king. You have been betrayed." The man was dragged away, dismissed as a mad prophet. But his words struck something deep inside Charles. And only hours later, destiny claimed him. As the army marched, a page accidentally dropped a lance. The clang of steel against stone shattered the silence. Charles froze. His eyes darkened. And then, something broke. The king drew his sword. With a scream that echoed through the forest, he turned on his own men. In blind fury, Charles attacked his companions, cutting down knights and squires who had sworn to protect him. None could stop him. His rage was unstoppable, his mind consumed by a storm no one understood. When at last he was subdued, for men lay dead by his own hand. The King of France had murdered his loyal subjects in madness. From that day forward, Charles was never the same. His fits came suddenly without warning. At times, he would run through the palace halls, howling like a beast, striking down servants. At other times, he could not recognize his wife, his children, or even his own name. He believed he was made of glass, fragile, breakable, terrified that the slightest touch would shatter him into 1,000 pieces. The court whispered. The nobles trembled. France no longer had a king of reason, but a king of madness. Power slipped from Charles's hands into those of his ambitious relatives. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, began to rule in his place, and with her came corruption, scandal, and betrayal. The dream of a united, strong France began to collapse. The well-beloved was gone. In his place sat Charles the Mad. Charles VI was no longer the king he once was. The man who had been called the well-beloved had vanished. In his place sat a ruler broken by madness. At times, Charles lived in silence, staring into the distance for hours, unblinking, unreachable. At other times, his fury returned like a storm, violent, uncontrollable, and terrifying. But strangest of all were the delusions that gripped his mind. The king believed that his body was made of glass. He trembled at the thought of shattering, of breaking into pieces. He forbade anyone to touch him suddenly. He would sit on his throne wrapped in iron rods sewn into his clothes, convinced that they would protect him from cracking. His courtiers watched in horror as the most powerful man in France refused to move, refused to be touched, convinced he was nothing more than fragile crystal. Other times, his madness took darker forms. He forgot his own name and lineage. When attendants bowed before him, he would ask, "Why do you kneel? I am not your king." He wandered the halls of the palace calling himself a humble servant, refusing to believe he wore the crown of France. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. At times, Charles regained clarity, only to slip again into madness. His kingdom never knew when its ruler might fall into another fit. But his madness did not only break his mind, it broke France. While the king was lost in delusions, power fell into the hands of his ambitious relatives, the dukes and nobles who hungered for control. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, soon became infamous for corruption, extravagance, and scandal. The people, once devoted to their well-beloved king, now cursed his name. To them, he was no longer a monarch chosen by God, but a cursed soul, dragging France into ruin. And yet, Charles lived on. Year after year, his madness deepened, his kingdom weakened, and his throne grew ever more unstable. The glass king sat fragile upon his seat of power. But around him wolves gathered. And soon, they would tear France apart. With the king lost to madness, France became a kingdom without a captain. Charles sat fragile on his throne, drifting between lucidity and insanity, while his realm slipped further into chaos. The power vacuum was too tempting. Around the broken monarch gathered hungry wolves, dukes, princes, and ambitious nobles, each determined to seize control. At the center of it all stood two rival factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. The Armagnacs, named for the powerful Count of Armagnac, claimed to defend the king's authority. They demanded loyalty to the crown, even though Charles himself could barely rule. The Burgundians, led by the cunning and ruthless Duke of Burgundy, sought to rule France in the king's name. To them, Charles's madness was an opportunity, and they would stop at nothing to take power. The Queen Isabeau of Bavaria played both sides. Her name became infamous across France. The people accused her of corruption, of draining the treasury, even of betraying her king with lovers in the shadows of the palace. Whether the rumors were true or not, her reputation shattered. To many, the queen was a serpent at the heart of France. And while France tore itself apart, its greatest enemy watched closely. Across the Channel, the English waited. The 100 Years' War had already dragged on for decades, and now, with France consumed by civil war, the English struck again. The king was incapable of leading. His generals fought one another more than the enemy. Battles raged not only against England but between Frenchmen themselves. Cities burned, fields lay barren, and peasants starved under the weight of endless war. The people began to despair. They cursed their king who could not save them. They cursed their nobles who bled them dry. And some whispered that God himself had abandoned France. The kingdom stood on the edge of ruin. The Valois dynasty, once glorious, now seemed fragile as glass, just like its broken king. And in the chaos, betrayal was never far. Blood would soon stain the streets of Paris itself, and the civil war would consume them all. France had become a land of shadows. Behind every oath was betrayal, and behind every smile lay a dagger. In Paris, the struggle between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians reached a fever pitch. Nobles who once dined together now plotted one another's deaths. The streets of the capital ran red with blood. The Duke of Burgundy, cunning, ambitious, ruthless, made his move. He ordered the assassination of his greatest rival, the Duke of Orleans, brother of King Charles VI. One night in 1407, assassins struck as Orleans rode through the streets of Paris. They hacked him to pieces, his blood staining the cobblestones. It was a message. The Burgundians had declared open war. The murder shocked France, but it also divided it further. The Armagnacs swore vengeance, raising their banners in the name of justice. Paris itself became a battleground, factions roaming the alleys, mobs dragging men from their homes, executions carried out in broad daylight. And all the while, the king sat broken, unaware, or unwilling to intervene. Sometimes Charles would rise from his madness, hear of the killings, and then fall back into his delusions. The kingdom had no leader, only predators. The people suffered the most. Taxes soared as nobles raised armies. Famine spread across the land. Commoners were slaughtered in massacres that painted the Seine red. The very heart of France was being torn apart, not by foreign invaders but by its own sons. But betrayal did not end there. Even allies turned on one another. The Queen, Isabeau, shifted her loyalties as easily as she changed her gowns. She played the Burgundians against the Armagnacs, all while ensuring her own survival. To the people, she was no longer queen, she was the witch of France. And in the midst of this chaos, a greater enemy waited patiently. The English, watching from across the Channel, prepared for their moment. Soon they would strike with fire and steel, claiming vengeance for centuries of war. The stage was set. France was bleeding from within, and its king was powerless to save it. The wolves were feasting. And soon, the Lion of England would arrive to claim the carcass. While France tore itself apart, the English king saw his chance. Henry V of England, young, brilliant, ruthless, landed with his army on French soil. His men were outnumbered, but their resolve was iron. In 1415, the two forces clashed at a place called Agincourt. The French knights, weighed down by armor, charged recklessly into muddy fields. The English, with their longbows, rained death upon them. Thousands of French nobles fell, slaughtered in the mire, their shining armor sinking into the mud like graves. It was not just a battle. It was humiliation. The flower of French chivalry had been destroyed. And where was their king? Charles VI, the man meant to lead them, sat locked away in his palace, lost in madness. He could not ride to battle. He could not rally his armies. He could barely remember that he was king. In Paris, despair ruled. The nobles turned on one another, even as English armies marched deeper into the heart of France. Betrayal became survival. The Burgundians, once enemies of England, now sought alliance with them. They handed Paris to the English without resistance. In 1420 came the unthinkable, the Treaty of Troyes. Charles VI, broken and defeated, was forced to disinherit his own son, the Dauphin of France, and name Henry V of England as heir to the French crown. The King of England would inherit France. To the French people, this was the final betrayal. Their king, once called the well-beloved, had become the mad king who lost their kingdom. By the time Charles died in 1422, France was no longer the land he had inherited. It was divided, conquered, and bleeding. His body, frail and broken, was carried to the grave in silence. No tears, no mourning. His people had long abandoned him. Charles VI's reign was a tragedy, not just of one man but of a nation. A king who began as beloved, ended as cursed. A ruler who dreamed of greatness, left only ruins. And in the halls of history, he is remembered forever by one name: the Mad King of France. Kings rise, kingdoms fall, but their stories live forever. This is Throne Unknown. Subscribe now, and never miss the untold history of the world's most powerful rulers.